Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending where you are in the world. Welcome to the midway through of another day of GDDF, our fourth year in this conference. And this year, I think there's an overarching theme that's definitely been across the conference and throughout our industry. And it's this thought of artificial intelligence, AI, machine learning. There's multiple terms that we use for this concept. And it's big, it's bold, it's scary, and it's exciting. So we're going to start in a keynote talking about AI. But before we do, please, in the chat, love to know who you are, where you work, what you're working on, and where you're working from today. Love to get an understanding of who's here and where you're at in your world. And also, bonus, love if you could share also some of your thoughts about AI. Is it visionary and amazing and wonderful? Is it horrible and scary? Is it going to take your job? So these are some kind of interesting, large questions to think about around AI, artificial intelligence, machine learning, natural language processing, generative AI, all these fun terms, scary terms, exciting terms. But now we're gonna learn a little bit more about them and think through how really we can use them to improve lives around the world, how we can incorporate them in development. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Fedra, who's going to take it away and give us a good understanding here of what we're thinking about when we should be thinking about AI in development. Over to you, Fedra.
Thank you so much, Wyan. It is such a pleasure to be here today. Let me tee up my slides. Thank you very much. So my day job at IBM is that I am IBM Consulting's global leader for trustworthy AI. There is absolutely nothing easy about this job. In fact, I've taken to illustrating comics as my own form of art therapy. And so you might see a couple of comics sprinkled here and there throughout my presentation. I can tell you that the emphasis on this presentation today is going to be very, very focused on a goal that was outlined within USAID's AI action plan. And this is a goal that I think all of us here are very intrinsically motivated to see through. And that is the idea of ensuring the AI tools better reflect the communities that they impact. I'm going to tee up a little bit of information at the beginning of this talk before I unveil who is the unlikely hero in order to achieve this particular goal. So when we talk about artificial intelligence, I think it's also very, very important to talk about power. And Mary Parker Follett famously in 1924 did a mapping of power, talking about do we give power to, do we have power with, or do we have power over? And indeed, when we talk about giving power to, this aligns very closely to the worldview of fairness associated with equity. The Maori Lab, who I am going to be talking about this particular organization a few times within this presentation, really gave it a very wonderful description of harnessing power with respect to AI. And I'm going to read it out, right? Harnessing power is to include the stakeholders and players in the ecosystem, people, planet, at every stage of the AI development, from creation to the all-important data collection to deployment and beyond. Now, the Maori also talked back in 2020, they published a document talking about data sovereignty and digital colonization. And notice how they're describing digital colonialism here, right? A new deployment of quasi-imperial power over a vast number of people without their explicit consent, manifested in rules, design, language, cultures, and belief systems by a vastly dominant power. Earning trust in artificial intelligence is not a technical problem. It's not a technical problem with a technical solution. It is a socio-technical problem, which desperately requires a holistic approach. And anytime you talk about holistic, right, you talk about people, process, tools, people meaning what's the right culture required to create AI responsibly, what are the right processes, meaning AI governance, safeguard rails, and then what are the right tools in AI engineering frameworks? When you start talking about culture, it's important to ask ourselves this fundamental question, right? What is the kind of relationship that we ultimately want to have with AI? And when we asked ourselves this question at IBM, we came up with these three major principles, right? The first is that the purpose of AI is not meant to displace people. It is meant to augment human intelligence. And then we as practitioners have to go further and talk about what is the experience like of a human once they've been augmented by AI. The second one is a statement about consent, right? Data and insights associated with those data belong to their creator alone, and that new technologies, including AI, have to be both transparent and explainable. When we think about what does it take to earn trust in AI, we came up with these 5 major pillars, right? And they seem really simplistic when you first hear them, right? For example, fairness. But what I think is fair might not be what you think is fair, what Wyan thinks is fair, because there's actually many different worldviews on fairness. So it's incredibly important to be very, very specific around what is your organization's worldview on fairness, right? And then there's explainability. As you've got an AI model that's making a decision or coming up with some kind of output, being able to know what data was being used to make that determination, what kind of expertise, right? Of course, is it tamper-proof? That's adversarial robustness. Transparency is there some way for you to know who's accountable for this model? How much better does it perform compared to a human? What's the level of accuracy? Where can you get this kind of information? Where was the last time it was audited? And of course, does it protect data privacy? I'd like to start off with this definition of the word data. Data is an artifact of the human experience. Right? We people make the data, or we make the machines that make the data. We humans are incredibly fallible with over 180 biases and counting. So AI can actually serve as a fantastic mirror for us to show us our own biases, but we have to be brave enough. Remember, I was talking about culture. We have to be brave enough to be introspective on our own biases, because prejudice is truly an emotional commitment to ignorance. One of the primary myths associated with AI is this one, right? Most people think that in order to develop AI, right, it's 100% coding, when in fact, over 70% of the effort is just picking what is the right data. So we desperately need people who are asking very, very difficult questions about data, like, was this gathered with consent? Is it indeed representative? Right? Is this the right kind of data to use for this particular use case? When we talk about culture, it's incredibly important to think about 3 major things. First is you have to approach this whole space with humility, right? An open growth mindset. The second thing associated with culture is that you really, really need to embrace diversity and inclusivity, right? Because indeed, the people who are developing AI today come from a very small, homogeneous group. So when you're looking at your team of data scientists, it's important to ask the questions like, how many women are on this team? How many minorities? How many ethnicities? How many worldviews are represented on this team? And then the third tier, right? I talked about open growth mindset, diversity. The third tier is multidisciplinary, right? Meaning, I mentioned you've got to have people trained to ask very, very hard questions about data, including our social scientists, anthropologists, psychologists, designers, sociologists, right? We need to be working very, very closely with different kinds of people, different kinds of humans, in order to make sure that indeed we are curating these data sets and approaches responsibly. I had a fantastic conversation with a chief responsible AI officer from another tech company that had published their risk assessments online publicly. And this is a snippet from one of her risk assessments, right? And when we were sitting down to have the conversation about this, she said, the hardest part about getting AI model owners to fill this out fill this out well, is that they have no idea how to talk about disparate impact. They do not know because they weren't really trained to do it. This is actually an illustration that I wrote on the plane. I drew out on a plane ride coming back from that, right? Because I point the finger back to education, right? You know, here's a university saying, you don't need to take that humanities class, Bob. You're getting an AIML degree. You see the champagne glasses chinking. Congratulations, Bob. You deployed the AI model to help our clients determine interest rates on loans in record time. You see the cover of the New York Times saying AI model systematized redlining in disadvantaged communities, but Bob doesn't know what redlining is. So again, it goes back to what are we teaching to in schools, and to whom are we teaching it, right? The question of trust in AI is evolving from do I trust this artificial intelligence to does the worldview being represented in this AI match my own, right? Back to the Maori. The Maori has said some very interesting things with respect to data that I think we should all be very aware of, right? So note this, it is a customary belief that when you share knowledge with people, that the person who you are sharing information with then acquires a spiritual part of you. Therefore, the customary Maori perspective is that Maori data contains Wairua, Maori, it becomes a form of genealogy and therefore becomes sacred. So to the Maori, their data is indeed sacred, which brings me to ChatGPT, right? So ChatGPT is an example of a large language model, right? Which is a form of generative AI. Now, there are some great things about large language models, right? They are really, really great at predicting the next syntactically correct word, but it does not understand meaning, right? So there are risks of things like having it generate outputs that are completely incorrect, that the outputs might be completely biased, right? You've got to ask yourselves the question as to where is the data coming from? Was it indeed gathered with consent? Whose worldview is being represented? And indeed, are there challenges with respect to security? So this is an example of an output that my sister put. My sister is a VR engineer for a gaming company. And so she asked the question, you know, who am I, with her name? And this is what one of the outputs was. And notice that there's annotations here, right? These little numbers that give outputs, but she didn't actually make these games. She's amazing. She's done all kinds of incredible things. She didn't actually write this book. She didn't actually make these games. But again, you can see that there's annotations that demonstrate evidence that isn't actually there, isn't actually attributed to her. And notice, you know, my mother, the first thing she asked or she said was, well, fix it. Like, go and, you know, tell the bot this is wrong. Go fix it. There is no way currently for her to go and fix it. It's important that we as subjects, we as end users, look for things when we're using AI models. In particular, when we look for things, when we look for proof of data lineage and provenance, right? So data lineage is the process of tracking the flow of data over time. And data provenance is where did you get this from? What is the origin of this particular data set? Now I'm going to go back now in my first few minutes and specifically address this issue. Like now that I've teed up sort of the issues around things like culture and data, gave you some examples from the Maori, a local community's point of view. Now I want to talk to you about where I see opportunity. So back to data lineage and provenance. Knowledge graphs actually offer a way to provide data lineage and provenance. A knowledge graph is a way of being able to visualize how ideas interconnect. Now we could have experts in local communities who are trusted data keepers, let's call them, to determine which sources of data to trust in order to curate these powerful knowledge graphs. So here's how something like this would work, right? you've got these local AI sentries, again, who would be trusted within their communities to determine what are trusted sources of data, right? That can go, and then we can extract both the entities and relationships that could describe both their culture as well as their language. A formal version of these knowledge graphs are called ontologies, right? Then the idea would be that there could be a marketplace so that people who want to develop AI could determine which trusted ontologies that they want to use in order to power their own artificial intelligence. And then again, this is a totally licensable opportunity where the profit again goes back to those local communities. And then it's those local community leaders that would then go on to ensure that these ontologies are then maintained. So I'm going to give you an example of who has actually done this really well in a minute. This is a snapshot of what an ontology looks like. And I know this looks complicated, right? This is an example of an ontology that describes attributes of leadership, right? These take a lot of work, but they offer, again, fantastic benefits because it explains, again, in a language with those values of that particular community, how ideas interconnect. And I promise you, this is far more art than it is technology. Far more art. So you need to, again, have different kinds of brains working on something like building out an ontology to represent an idea. And you need to be working, again, very, very closely with domain experts. So here is our unlikely hero. It's the librarian, right? Who better to trust to be an AI sentry than a librarian? And maybe it's called something different within a local community, but someone who indeed is the keeper of trusted knowledge within their local domain. So a couple of weeks ago, a dear friend of mine and I, we were in DC presenting this idea to a giant conference for librarians. And there were librarians from all over the world and libraries we were being represented. Can you guess the librarian's response to what I just showed you? I'll tell you, their response was they were overjoyed, absolutely overjoyed at this idea, right? That they could evolve the kinds of things that they were doing in order to be able to have more representation in how AI is developed. But their biggest concern was how to get a seat at the table. How does it actually happen, right? And so to a community that has actually done this, I'll point again back to the Maori, the Maori Lab has developed an AI in the Maori language using the values of the Maori people, right? What is important to the Maori people, including making damn well sure you gather everything with consent and offering attribution. So notice their 4 pillars: people, planet, time, purpose. To honor the past, we care for the present and protect for the future. It is our responsibility. We do not own people or places. We value unity and diversity. Again, just a beautiful approach with respect to how they develop their own AI. I'd really welcome you. Much has been written about this particular use case. It is well worth your time. Indeed, this same group has licensed use of their ontology to other indigenous groups who want to use it. And you have to have written express permission in order to be able to use their body of work. So what I would ask of all of us is to consider what needs to happen in order for this vision to be made real, right? I would opine, and I'd welcome you to include your feedback on what is it going to take to get these librarians or AI sentries in their local communities a seat at this table. We need tooling for them to be able to easily maintain. That is not GORPy, that is not hard to use. Marketplaces to license those local ontologies. And again, this is an opportunity for a revenue stream directly to those local communities. And then again, education. And this is where I could really use your help. We desperately need for all of us to work together to advocate for far more inclusivity and accessibility on who gets invited to the table, right? And including who gets education on the subject of data and AI ethics, on the subject of responsible curation of artificial intelligence, right? If you're lucky enough today to take a class in data and AI ethics, typically you're in a higher ed institution and you have self-categorized as a coder, machine learning scientist, data scientist, and not everybody else. Remember how I said it is truly multidisciplinary? And indeed, building those ontologies is far more art than it is tech. We desperately, again, need to be marketing and communicating this space to far more different kinds of people. And I would opine even to communicate it to people much earlier on in their academic career. There's, for example, exercises, design thinking exercises that we do with clients to get them to think about disparate impact that we've also done with middle school kids. We've done this with high school kids, right? And there's some excellent resources. There's already games out there to introduce children to algorithmic bias. MIT has a fantastic curriculum that they've developed for middle school children on the subject of data and AI ethics. I started the Future World Alliance with a dear friend of mine at Microsoft who's in a similar position to me, curating curriculum for K through 12 students. MindSpark is a nonprofit that we work with that has curated curriculum for teachers in kindergarten through 12th grade to get them to understand, in particular, social studies teachers, how to introduce the subject of artificial intelligence to their students. So really, there are tremendous opportunities for us to really be able to re-emphasize our efforts in both empowering local communities through things like knowledge graphs, ontologies, working more closely with those knowledge keepers, right? The librarians, as an example, as well as rethinking, like, how are we teaching this in schools today? Not just abroad, but here in our own backyard. Thank you so much for your time. I'll take any questions that you might have. Wyan, what are you seeing in the chat?
Well, Fedra, I am seeing some amazing questions and comments. Certainly, there's been a real outpouring of support around this idea that librarians are central to being AI sentries. I mean, I personally love it, being on a project beyond libraries that was really focused on how to think of librarians and libraries in general as a knowledge resource across ICT and all kinds of technology, not just AI. And then it was funny, several people have commented that your concept about being a multidisciplinarian, if I could say that word correctly, and humanities degrees. Nick Martin actually is a poet, if you didn't know it. And what is it? Leland Smith was said that his classics degree finally is going to be applicable now. So I think in that sense, it's great that we have kind of this concept that you have to think about AI as a data, as a human, as an anthology problem, not as a technology problem. I think that was a really strong viewpoint. One of the questions I thought that was very interesting was the concept of time bound. Like, if we have this concept of data and we have this concept of allowing others to use it, like you had for the Maori, Melton Leons was questioning, can we say it is for a certain time and period? Because as our understanding of AI changes, our consent to that AI model may change. And certainly our lived experience will create new and different data. So could we say, like, this data is only good for this model for this period of time, and then afterwards it ends, right? Or so, because otherwise, like, it could be trained on, I mean, I'm thinking of data from when I was a young man. I hope to God that data is all buried and disappeared and no one ever goes back and looks at how stupid I was as a teenager. And I think of now when we're putting data of our children online, what happens to them when they are now adults, and all of a sudden this training data comes back and shows imageries built on them as a child. So what's your thoughts, Fedra?
I think it's an excellent point. And yes, it does need to be time bound. And it's not only because the artifacts might change. It might be because our worldviews may indeed change, as they have as they indeed have. So that's one of the reasons why I greatly appreciate that time was one of the pillars that the Maori expressly put as associated with their worldview on how they develop artificial intelligence. Because indeed, I think they too recognize that ideas change over time. They're not, set in concrete. And it's why we need to make sure that these ontologies or these knowledge graphs are maintained by the local communities. One of the things that I have found working with clients is that so often C-suite, they will fund the design, development, deployment of an AI model, but not the maintenance, nothing that, it incurs costs because you must maintain it, not only to make sure that there isn't model drift, not only because you need to audit the model for bias regularly or accuracy regularly, but indeed just to make sure that it indeed stays representative to solve the problem that you're trying to solve. So yeah, definitely, yes, on time. And thank you for the comments about the librarians. I was so pleased to be able to talk to them and again get their excitement. And now trying to figure out, like, okay, how do we get them a seat at that table? What will it take in order to get there?
Well, one of the questions brought up by Barbara Phillip was that concept of a librarian. If you think of a librarian who is sitting far away from the end user, like a librarian in a global north country interpreting data for a global south country, I think that how can we make sure that they are not yet another level of abstraction from the actuality and the experience? And at the same time, I think Barbara made a great point. We often default when we hear the word data to numbers, actual, 1, 2, 3, etc. When the term data should really be very much a holistic concept, image, sound, the human experience. And as someone else said, AI is a machine. It doesn't have emotion. And also it doesn't have citizenship, which I think is another aspect here of this concept of how can we make sure that it's locally owned, or at least, if you will, has citizenship in a certain country or context and not used and abused across. So love your thoughts
on things.
Go for it.
So the librarians that I had in mind are local, and maybe it's not the word librarian for them. Maybe it's elder, but it's someone who is trusted in their community to know which data sources are most representative of that particular community. So these would be, again, local domain experts. And then with respect to data and, thinking its numbers, I love the definition that my dear friend Beth Rudden came up with. She was a distinguished engineer and an anthropologist at IBM. Data is an artifact of the human experience. And again, all of our data is biased. So it's not just the numbers. It's indeed like, everything that we're creating throughout our lives, including our data exhaust, right? Which is now being monetized. Like it is far more than just the numbers. And it's why it's so interesting how the Maori talk about it as being indeed something that is sacred to them. So.
Yeah, that's awesome. And that concept here, we're thinking about, I love the concept of Maori saying, you have to think of it as a part of ourselves. And that idea that, if you have the thought in your mind and then someone, you know it's there, but no one else knows it's there. And I'm thinking, once you put it down, once you put it into the machine and it gets abstracted out, how is it yours? And it feels very like, I love the terminology when we talk about photography. We talk about taking a photograph. We are shooting someone. And I think that's a really interesting thought and language to use. And we should be thinking about that language when we were thinking about AI as well. How much are we really extracting from people versus giving or creating with people?
And I think this is something I mentioned, education, and how important it is to introduce these ideas even to children, right? So that they understand early what kinds of things that they should expect to see from AI. What are the kinds of things they should ask for or be thinking critically about whenever they interact with an AI? These are desperately things that we've got to be introducing to children today.
So thank you so much, Phaedra, for being part of this discussion today. And for those who are still with us, please look in the chat. I've put down a link to where we can continue this discussion in the forums. So thank you so much, and on with GDDF.